Jericho Hale had just 60 cents in his pocket, no home to sleep in, and no one left in the world who even knew his name. Then the richest woman in the city walked past him and dropped her wallet. It landed on the sidewalk right in front of his shoes. Inside was more money than Jericho had ever seen in his entire life. And for a moment, the entire street seemed to pause, waiting to see what a hungry boy with nothing left would choose to do. He had nothing. No roof, no parent, and no meal sitting warm on any table anywhere in the city. Just the streets, the noise, and the particular kind of hunger that does not only live in the stomach, but in the eyes. That afternoon, Jericho Hale was working a traffic light on the west side of downtown, the kind of intersection where luxury cars slowed just long enough for him to drag a torn rag across a windshield and hope the window rolled down with a coin. Most of the time, it did not. Most of the time, the driver stared straight ahead, as though the boy pressing his cloth to the glass did not exist at all. Jericho was 12 years old. He had been surviving the streets of the city for 3 years, ever since the shelter fire took the last person in the world who had called him by name. He did not beg. He had made himself a rule about that. He worked, washed windows, collected bottles, carried bags outside the grocery warehouse on 5th when the morning shift manager was in a generous mood. At night, he returned to the space beneath the old overpass on Clement Street, where a small community of forgotten people shared warmth, silence, and the unspoken agreement that no one would ask anyone else their story unless they offered it first. He was thin. His sneakers had been white once, and the jacket he wore was 3 sizes too large and had been found in a dumpster behind a church hall the previous winter. But his eyes were clear. That was the thing people noticed, the rare ones who actually looked. His grandmother had given him that. Not the eyes themselves, but whatever lived behind them. She had died when Jericho was 8, just before everything fell apart. Her last words to him, spoken in the hospital with a hand pressed to his small face, had never left him. Jericho, people may forget you, but God never will. He had carried those words through every cold night, every empty afternoon, every moment when the city had looked straight through him as though he were made of air. They were the only thing he owned that could not be lost, stolen, or thrown away. It was a Tuesday. The sun was dropping toward the tops of the glass towers downtown, turning the whole street gold. Our Jericho had earned 60 cents by 3 in the afternoon and decided to move closer to the business district, where the cars were bigger and the occasional guilty conscience produced a folded bill. He was standing near the corner of Meridian Avenue and 42nd, watching the flow of people moving in and out of the tall buildings, when he saw the black car pull up. It was the kind of car that did not need a model name to announce itself. Long, quietly powerful, the kind that parks where it wants because the world simply moves around it. The back door opened. A woman stepped out. She was tall, dressed in a navy wrap dress and a cream-colored coat, a handbag hanging from one arm, a phone already pressed to her ear before her heels touched the pavement. Everything about her said time is money and the clock is running. Her voice carried through the noise of the street with the particular authority of someone who is used to being heard. I told him the terms were final," she said sharply into the phone. "If the board wants to push back, let them push back in writing." She was walking fast toward the entrance of the glass tower that bore the words Vail Technologies in brushed steel letters 4 stories above the street. She never looked down. The wallet slipped from the open flap of her bag and landed flat on the sidewalk without a sound. The crowd moved around it. No one stopped. No one noticed, except Jericho. He stepped forward slowly, the way you approach something that does not quite feel real yet. He crouched down and picked it up. The leather was soft in a way that made his rough fingertips feel the difference immediately. Thick, heavy, the kind of object that does not belong in this part of the afternoon. He opened it. His breath stopped in his chest. Cash. Real cash, more than he had ever held in his life, folded neatly inside like it was nothing. On the other side, platinum cards caught the fading light. There was an ID card too, with a sharp professional photo and a name printed beneath it. Serafina Vail, Chief Executive Officer, Vail Technologies. Jericho had seen that name before, on the building across from the shelter, on the side of buses. Once on a television screen in a shop window, a news segment about a business deal involving hundreds of millions of dollars. A name that meant power in this city the way weather meant clouds. Everyone knew it. Nobody questioned it. He stood still for a moment. A boy from the overpass noticed him from across the light and wandered over, leaning in to look at what Jericho was holding. His eyes went wide. "Brother, you are holding a whole new life right there." Another voice behind him laughed low. "Nobody saw you pick that up. Just walk. Walk fast and don't look back." Jericho stared at the cash. His stomach moved with a slow, grinding pain that he had learned to ignore but never actually could. He had not eaten a full meal since Sunday. He thought about the food vendor on Hadley Street who sold rice and chicken and how the smell of it hit you from half a block away. He thought about a bed. A real one. He thought about what it would feel like to be warm at night without calculating whether the warmth would last until morning. Then he thought about his grandmother's face. "Even if we have nothing," she had told him once, "we do not take what is not ours. Not because people are watching, because God is." Jericho closed the wallet. His stomach growled audibly. He looked up at the glass tower where Serafina Vale had disappeared. His legs did not feel fully steady as he began walking toward it. But he kept walking. Through the crowd, across the wide stone plaza, past the fountain that no one stopped to look at in a city moving this fast. He could see the uniformed guards at the entrance now. Two of them. Large, arms crossed, eyes scanning everyone who came close. He slowed down slightly, then tightened his grip on the wallet, and kept moving forward. Because somewhere between his chest and his throat, his grandmother's voice was the loudest thing in the world. As he approached the gate, one of the guards stepped directly into his path. He looked at Jericho the way people looked at things they wanted to move off the street. "Where are you going?" "I need to return something," Jericho said quietly. The guard's eyes dropped to the wallet. His expression shifted. And before Jericho could say another word, the man's hand clamped around his wrist. "Thief," the guard said. Loud, flat. A word dropped like a verdict. The second guard moved in immediately. People near the entrance turned to look. A woman pulling a rolling suitcase stepped back. A man in a suit slowed his walk to observe. Someone shook their head. "I am not a thief," Jericho said. And his voice broke halfway through the sentence, not from dishonesty, but from the particular devastation of knowing you did the right thing and being punished for it anyway. "I found it. I just want to give it back." No one listened. They pulled him toward the security office at the side of the building, and the heavy door swung shut behind them, and the noise of the city disappeared. Inside the building, on the 31st floor, Serafina Vale stood at the window of her office, her phone still in her hand, her mind already on the board meeting scheduled for that evening. The one that someone inside her company may have been quietly preparing to use against her. She did not yet know her wallet was gone. She did not yet know who had found it. And she had no idea that the thin 12-year-old boy being accused in the room below her was the same person God had positioned, years before she was ever born, to bring the truth she needed most into the light. And if you're still watching and you feel this story pulling at something real inside you, go ahead and subscribe right now, because what happens next will not let you walk away. Drop a comment below and tell me, would you have returned the wallet? 3 years earlier, Jericho Hale had a last name that meant something and a grandmother who prayed every morning before the sun fully rose. Then came the fire. Then came the streets. And then came the long, quiet education of learning to survive in a city that does not stop moving long enough to notice the people it leaves behind. This is where his story really begins. His grandmother, Miriam Hale, had lived in a small apartment on the east side with enough faith to fill a cathedral and enough love to make a child feel like the whole world was safe. She woke before dawn every morning, put water on the stove, and knelt beside her bed with her hands folded and her lips moving quietly. Jericho used to watch her from the doorway, still half asleep, wondering what she said to God at that hour. She never told him. But she always rose from her knees with the same settled expression, like someone who had just received good news from a source the rest of the world could not access. She died on a Wednesday in October, and by the following spring, Jericho's parents were gone too. taken in a shelter fire that the city recorded as accidental and then promptly forgot. Saw he was 9 years old. No relatives came forward. The system processed him briefly and then lost him in the way systems lose children who have no one loud enough to ask questions on their behalf. He had been on the street since he was 9, but Miriam's words had never left him. Not once. And it was those words, "God sees what the world ignores," that were still echoing in his chest when the security office door opened, and the sharp sound of heels on polished floor announced that someone important had arrived. Serafina Vale stepped into the room. She was still holding her phone. Her coat was slightly open from walking fast. Her eyes moved quickly from the guards to Jericho. And something about the way she assessed the room told Jericho she was a woman who made decisions quickly and rarely reversed them. "What is happening here?" she asked. Her voice was controlled but not cold. The senior guard straightened immediately. "Ma'am, we caught this boy outside the entrance with your wallet. We believe he did not steal it," Jericho said quietly. The guard turned toward him sharply, but Serafina held up one hand and the guard went silent. She looked at Jericho directly. Really looked. The way very few adults had ever looked at him. Not through him, not past him, not at his clothes or his shoes, or the particular quality of his poverty. At him. "Where did you find it?" she asked. "The sidewalk. It fell from your bag when you got out of the car. I saw it happen. I tried to follow you, but the crowd was fast, and then the guards—" "Give it to me." He held it out to her. She opened it, checked the cash, checked the cards, unchecked the interior pockets. Everything was exactly where it should be. She closed it slowly and stood with it in her hand for a moment, the room very quiet around her. "Nothing is missing," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. The guard shifted uncomfortably behind her. Serafina looked at Jericho again. There was something in his stillness that unsettled her in a way she could not immediately name. He was not fidgeting. He was not performing. He simply stood in the posture of someone who knows the truth and is prepared to wait for the world to catch up to it. "There's something else," Jericho said carefully. "Inside the wallet. When I opened it to find out who it belonged to, I saw a folded note between the cards. I did not read it on purpose. It was open." Serafina's expression did not move. "What did it say?" she asked. Jericho met her eyes. "The board meeting tonight is a setup. Don't trust Mercer." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from the one before it. Heavier. The guard near the door looked at the floor. The second guard looked at the first. Serafina's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and for just a moment something moved through her eyes that looked like recognition. The particular expression of someone who has suspected something for a long time and has just received the confirmation they were not entirely prepared for. And she turned to the guards. "Leave us." They filed out without argument. The door clicked shut. Serafina pulled out the folded note from the interior pocket of the wallet and read it in full. She folded it again carefully. She looked at Jericho for a long time. "Who are you?" she asked finally. "Jericho Hale." "How old are you?" 12. She looked at the state of his jacket, at the shoes, or at the calloused hands of a child who had been working the streets since before he should have needed to. Something shifted in her posture. Not pity. Jericho had been looked at with pity enough to recognize it immediately. This was something closer to respect, or the beginning of it. "I could give you money," she said. "Most people in your position would expect that." Jericho said nothing. "But I don't think that's what you actually need." She paused. "If you want to change your life, come work for it. Real work. I run a youth mentorship program attached to this building. There is a residential component, meals, schooling." She tilted her head slightly. "What I cannot offer you is a handout. What I can offer you is a door." Jericho thought about the overpass. About 60 cents and a torn rag, and the smell of food he could not afford. He thought about his grandmother's voice. "I will take the door," he said. "If you are still with me right now, drop 'I'm still here' in the comments. I need to know you are watching. Because what is about to happen next is the part that changes everything." By the following morning, Jericho had been given a small room in the residential wing of the Vail Technologies youth program on the building's fourth floor. It had a bed, a window, a desk, and a door that locked from the inside. He stood in the middle of it for a full 2 minutes after the coordinator left, unsure what to do with stillness that did not feel dangerous. He ate a full meal for the first time in 4 days. He slept without listening for footsteps. But the building was watching him, even if he did not yet know it. By the second afternoon, whispers were already moving through the executive floors. Some were dismissive, some were sharp. A few were genuinely curious about the homeless boy Serafina Vale had brought off the street and installed on the fourth floor, like he belonged there. Staff members passed him in the corridor with expressions that ranged from mild pity to open skepticism. One man said nothing at all. Carlton Mercer, Senior Vice President of Financial Strategy, stood at the glass wall of the third-floor conference room and watched Jericho cross the lobby below with a cup of juice from the cafeteria. Mercer was a composed man. 61 years old, silver at the temples, the kind of professional stillness that came from decades of careful self-management. He did not raise his voice. He did not make impulsive gestures. But his eyes followed the boy until Jericho disappeared around the corner. Then he turned back to his desk and picked up his phone. He dialed without speaking, waited for the line to connect, and said only 3 words before ending the call. "Take care of it." That night, Jericho was preparing for bed when something pulled his attention to the window. A stillness in the movement outside, a shape in the shadow of the building across the narrow service road, still in the particular way that people are still when they are trying not to be noticed. Someone was watching the fourth-floor window. Jericho stepped back from the glass. He turned to his door. Taped just below the handle, on the inside, was a small folded piece of paper that had not been there when he left for dinner. He pulled it off and opened it. The writing was brief and neat. "Street rats should stay on the street." Jericho stood with the note in his hand and did not move for a long time. He had chosen honesty. He had taken the door that was offered. He had done nothing wrong. And yet the city had followed him inside. The first week passed quietly enough. Jericho was assigned simple tasks through the youth program, filing documents in the administrative office, organizing supply deliveries, helping the facilities coordinator with basic inventory. Work he understood. Work that kept his hands busy and his mind from dwelling too long on the note that had appeared on his door. He had not told Serafina about it. He was not sure why. Perhaps because reporting a threat felt like confirming what everyone already suspected, that he did not belong here, that his presence was a problem to be managed rather than a life worth protecting. He had learned early that complaining for people in his position rarely produced anything except confirmation that the world found them inconvenient. So he kept his head down and he worked. But the building had its own atmosphere, and Jericho was sensitive to atmospheres. The 3 years on the streets had sharpened him in ways that formal education never could. He noticed things. The way a conversation stopped when he entered a room and resumed at a slightly different register after he left. The way certain staff members on the executive floors looked through him with the specific blankness of people who had decided, before meeting him, exactly who and what he was. One woman in accounts had taken to moving her bag to the opposite side of her desk whenever he came in to collect documents. She did it without thinking. That was the worst part. It was not even deliberate hostility. It was just reflex. Mercer he saw only occasionally, and always at a distance. But distance, Jericho had learned, was not the same as absence. Twice he arrived at the supply room to find his organized inventory deliberately rearranged. The careful system he had built over several days, undone overnight with no explanation. Once, a small petty cash pouch went missing from the administrative office on the same morning Jericho had been in to collect a delivery receipt. The office manager did not accuse him directly. She simply looked at him for a long moment before calling the finance team, and Jericho felt the weight of that look settle on his shoulders like something physical. The pouch was found later, behind a cabinet. No one mentioned it again. But the seed had been planted. On the 9th morning, Jericho arrived at the youth program workroom at 8:30 to find his backpack sitting open on the table where he had left it the previous evening. He did not remember leaving it open. He crossed the room, reached for it out of habit, and a hand closed around his wrist from behind. He turned. Two security officers, both in full uniform, neither with an expression that suggested this was a misunderstanding. "See, step away from the bag, son." Jericho stepped back. The senior officer reached into the backpack and withdrew a thick brown envelope. He set it on the table and opened it slowly. Banded stacks of company cash, still bearing the Veil Technologies' internal disbursement labels, fanned out across the surface. The room, which had been quiet, became the particular kind of quiet that precedes a verdict. Other staff members had gathered at the workroom door. Jericho could see their faces in the glass panel, some wide-eyed, some already narrowed with certainty. A woman near the back shook her head slowly. Someone said something to the person beside them that Jericho could not hear but did not need to. "This is not mine," Jericho said. His voice was steady. He was surprised by that. "The bag is yours," the officer said. "The money is not. That is what an investigation will determine." And there it was again. The same word from 3 years ago, are dressed in different clothing. Thief. It did not always need to be spoken aloud to be heard. It lived in the posture of the officers, in the gathered faces at the door, in the particular quality of silence that a room produces when it has already made up its mind. Jericho stood very still and thought about his grandmother and the way she used to say that the truth does not need your help to survive. It only needs you to refuse to abandon it. He did not speak again. He did not need to. Because 30 seconds later, the workroom door opened fully and Serafina Vale walked in. She had clearly been pulled from something important. Her reading glasses were still in her hand. She looked at the money on the table. She looked at the officers. Then she looked at Jericho, and he looked back at her. And something passed between them that did not require words. The same quiet transaction that had taken place in the security office on the first day. She turned to the senior officer. "Where was this found?" "Inside the boy's backpack, ma'am. Left here overnight." Serafina said nothing for a moment. She set her glasses down on the table beside the money and looked at it carefully, as though reading something in the arrangement of it that no one else in the room could see. Then she looked up. "Pull every security camera in this building," she said. "Every corridor, every access point to this floor. And I want footage from the last 18 hours on a screen in the boardroom in 20 minutes. The officer hesitated. "Ma'am, the evidence is not evidence until we know how it got there." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. 20 minutes. The room shifted. Jericho noticed it, a barely perceptible movement among the gathered staff, as though several people had taken a very small step backward. Not everyone, but enough. Someone in that room knew what the cameras would show. The boardroom filled quickly. Serafina stood at the head of the table. The security team pulled the footage on the main screen, moving backward through the overnight hours in fast sequence. Corridor by corridor, floor by floor. At 11:47 the previous evening, the cameras found what they were looking for. Carlton Mercer, moving through the fourth-floor corridor alone. The building was nearly empty at that hour. He carried a brown envelope under one arm and wore no jacket over his shirt, or as though he had come back to the building after hours for something he considered routine. He entered the youth program workroom. He crossed to the table where Jericho's backpack sat. He opened it. He placed the envelope inside. He left. The footage was 17 seconds long. No one in the boardroom spoke for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. Then someone exhaled. Then someone else. And the sound that moved through the room was not quite a gasp, and not quite a word, but something between them. The involuntary sound people make when a thing they half suspected turns out to be completely true. Mercer was sitting at the far end of the table. He did not look at the screen. He looked at his hands, folded quietly on the table in front of him, with the composed expression of a man who had already moved through his available options and found none of them satisfactory. Serafina turned to him slowly. "Carlton," she said. He said nothing. "How long?" she asked. He was quiet for another moment. Then he lifted his eyes from his hands and looked at her with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has finally, perhaps with some measure of relief, been allowed to put it down. "Long enough," he said. The investigation that followed moved quickly. The finance team confirmed what the cameras had begun to suggest: systematic withdrawals, redirected accounts, falsified disbursement records spanning several years. Mercer had been extracting funds from the company through channels so carefully constructed that 3 separate audits had passed over them without detection. Jericho sat in a chair outside the boardroom while the pieces assembled themselves inside, listening to the muffled sounds of a world coming apart behind a closed door. And a junior compliance officer emerged at some point and sat down nearby to take a preliminary statement. She asked Jericho standard questions in a professional tone. When she was done writing, she paused and looked at her notes. "Did you know anyone connected to Veil Technologies before this week?" she asked. "No," Jericho said. She looked at her notes again. "Are your parents living?" The question landed in the ordinary way that question always landed. Jericho answered it the way he always answered it. "No. They died when I was young." She wrote something down. "Their names?" "Daniel and Ruth Hale." The officer's pen stopped moving. She looked up at him slowly. "Daniel and Ruth Hale," she repeated. "Yes?" She looked down at whatever was in her notes for a moment, that stretched slightly too long for a routine question. Then she closed the folder carefully and said she would be right back. And she stood and went directly back into the boardroom without knocking. Jericho watched the door close behind her. He sat with the silence and the particular feeling of being at the edge of something vast. The way the air changes just before a storm, not with violence but with an impossible stillness, as though the world itself is holding its breath. 2 minutes later, Serafina came out. She sat down in the chair the officer had vacated. She looked at Jericho with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not the composed authority he had come to associate with her. Something quieter, more careful. "Jericho," she said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to stay calm when I do." He nodded. "Do you know what your parents did for work?" He thought back. He had been young. He remembered a desk at home covered in papers. He remembered his mother on the phone late at night, her voice low and serious. He remembered the word his father used sometimes when he thought Jericho was asleep. "Something with numbers," Jericho said slowly. "Investigating something. I was too young to understand it." Serafina looked at him for a long moment. "They were auditors," she said. "Independent financial investigators. And according to documents that Mercer's team has been trying to bury for over a decade, they were investigating a fraud network connected directly to him." The corridor was very quiet. "Yes, they were getting close to something," Serafina continued, "and then their case file was closed, and they were gone." Jericho heard her words arrive one at a time, each one taking its full weight before the next one came. "The fire," he said. Serafina did not look away. "The investigation has been reopened. That is all I know right now." Jericho sat with that for a moment. 3 years on the streets. 3 years of hunger and cold and invisibility. 3 years of surviving a loss he had always understood as tragedy. And now, sitting in a corridor of a glass tower, the loss was beginning to take a different shape entirely. His life on the streets had not started with an accident. It may have started with a decision. Someone else's decision. He looked down at his hands. The same hands that had picked up a wallet on a sidewalk and chosen, without fully knowing why, to do the right thing. And he understood, armed with the quiet certainty of someone receiving a truth their bones already knew, that he had not ended up here by chance. They found Mercer in the underground garage. He had left the boardroom quietly, in the way that men who have spent decades managing appearances know how to leave rooms, without urgency, without drama, as though departing for something scheduled. No one stopped him immediately because no one expected him to run. He was Carlton Mercer. He had sat at that table for 11 years. He had attended the company's anniversary dinners and signed off on charity initiatives and shaken the hands of city officials at fundraising events. Men like that did not run. But he was running. The garage security feed caught him at the elevator, moving faster than his usual composed stride. A bag over one shoulder that had not been with him in the boardroom. He was heading for the lower level, on where his personal car was parked in a reserved bay that bore his name on a small placard, a detail that would later strike Jericho as quietly significant. Even in flight, the man had a designated space. Serafina was already moving when the security officer showed her the feed. She took the stairwell. Two officers followed. Jericho came too, not because anyone told him to, but because something in him understood, with the instinct of someone who had learned to read situations before they fully revealed themselves, that this moment belonged to him as much as it belonged to anyone. The garage was cool and low-lit, the particular gray stillness of underground spaces that exist only as transitions between one world and another. Their footsteps crossed the concrete in quick succession. They reached Mercer at his car. He had the door open. He looked up when he heard them, and for just a moment his composure attempted to reassemble itself, the jaw setting, the shoulders adjusting, and then it did not. Because the expression on Serafina's face did not leave room for composure. "Carlton," she said. "Stop." He stopped. He stood beside the open car door with his bag over his shoulder and looked at her, and then past her at the two officers, and then, last, at Jericho. Something moved across his face when his eyes landed on the boy. Not guilt exactly. Something older than guilt. The expression of a man confronting a consequence he designed himself. The police arrived within 11 minutes. Serafina had made the call from the stairwell. They came in quietly, the way police arrive when the situation has already resolved itself, and what remains is only paperwork and procedure. Mercer sat on the concrete barrier beside his car and did not resist. He set his bag down between his feet and folded his hands and looked at the floor of the garage with the particular stillness of a man who has finally, after a very long time, run out of moves. One of the officers began the formal process. Rights read. Questions asked in the measured cadence of procedure. Then Serafina stepped forward. "I want to know about Daniel and Ruth Hale," she said. The garage went quiet except for the distant sound of the city above them, muffled and indifferent. Mercer looked up. He looked at Jericho again. Really looked, the way he had been carefully avoiding since the boardroom. And Jericho looked back at him and did not look away, because he had been looked through by the world for 3 years, and he was done making himself small for anyone's comfort. Mercer exhaled slowly through his nose. "They were going to file the report in the spring," he said. His voice was flat. Professional even now, as though delivering a quarterly summary. Daniel Hale had reconstructed the full network, 14 accounts across 6 institutions. If that report reached the regulators, it would have ended everything. He paused. "I could not allow that." "So you ended them instead," Serafina said. Mercer did not answer that directly. He did not need to. The answer was already living in every year of Jericho's life that had followed. "The car," one of the officers said. "Yes," Mercer said quietly. One word, one syllable. The full weight of it settling onto the garage floor like something that had been suspended for a long time and had finally been released. Jericho heard it and felt something move through his chest that had no clean name. It was grief and rage and relief and devastation all arriving at the same moment, and the combination of them produced not sound but silence. A deep, physical silence that began somewhere behind his sternum and expanded outward until it was the only thing he could feel. His parents had not died because of chance or fire or the particular cruelty of circumstance that claims people without reason. They had died because they were honest, because they had found the truth and refused to look away from it, because they were exactly the kind of people who do not disappear quietly when powerful men ask them to. He had inherited that from them without ever knowing it. He had carried it through 3 years of streets and cold and hunger and invisibility. He had carried it to a sidewalk on a Tuesday afternoon and bent down to pick up a wallet. Jericho closed his eyes briefly, and in the dark behind them he heard his grandmother's voice, not as memory exactly, but as presence. The same voice that had kept him honest in the moment of greatest temptation. The same voice that had walked with him across that plaza and through the gate and into every hard day that followed. God sees what the world ignores. He opened his eyes. The same act of honesty that returned the wallet had led Serafina to trust him. Her trust had brought him inside the building. His presence inside the building had made Mercer afraid. Mercer's fear had made him careless. And his carelessness had unraveled 11 years of buried crime in the space of a single morning. A 12-year-old boy with no home and 60 cents to his name had walked into this building with nothing but his integrity. And it had been enough. It had been exactly enough. A Mercer was taken into custody without drama. The officers were professional and thorough, and the whole thing was over in the way that endings sometimes are. Not with explosion, but with the quiet mechanical finality of a door closing on a room that will not be opened again. In the weeks that followed, the consequences spread outward from that garage in concentric circles. The Vail Technologies Board convened an emergency session and accepted the resignation of 3 executives connected to Mercer's network. An independent audit confirmed financial misconduct spanning 9 years. Regulatory bodies opened formal proceedings. The city's financial press covered the story with the particular appetite that stories about powerful men falling tend to produce. The names Daniel and Ruth Hale appeared in the official investigation report as the original auditors whose findings Mercer had suppressed and whose deaths were now under renewed criminal inquiry. Their professional reputations, quietly buried alongside them, were formally restored. Their work, the report they had given their lives to complete, was entered into the public record. They had been right all along. They had simply needed the world to catch up to them. Serafina came to speak with Jericho on a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after the arrest. They sat in her office on the 31st floor, the city spread out in every direction behind the glass, and she placed a document on the desk between them. It was an enrollment confirmation, a full scholarship to one of the city's best secondary schools beginning in the autumn term. Housing through the Vail Foundation's youth program for as long as he needed it. A named education fund, the Hale Scholarship, established in his parents' memory, which would also support other children aging out of the shelter system. "I am not trying to replace what you lost," Serafina said carefully. "Nothing does that. But I can make sure the road ahead of you is worthy of who you already are." Jericho looked at the document for a long moment. "They would have wanted this," he said. "Not about himself, about the other children, about the scholarship bearing their name." Serafina nodded. "I know." He signed where she indicated. On a Saturday in late October, Jericho walked out of the Vail Technologies building alone and stood on the wide stone plaza in the morning light. The city was moving around him the way it always moved, continuous, indifferent, vast. The same traffic, the same towers, near the same sidewalk where he had once washed windshields for coins and searched the faces of strangers for any sign that he existed to them. He looked down at the exact spot where the wallet had fallen. An ordinary square of pavement, nothing remarkable about it. The kind of place you pass 1,000 times without looking. He looked up at the building. Then he looked up further, past the steel letters and the glass and the clean geometry of power, past all of it, into the open sky above the city that had forgotten him and found him and would never be able to say his parents' names without also saying his. He whispered it quietly, the way his grandmother had prayed. Not performing it for anyone, just offering it upward in the simple direction of whatever listens. "Grandma, you were right. God really does see the ones the world forgets." The city kept moving. But Jericho Hale stood still in the middle of it, 12 years old, with a road ahead of him and a name that meant something again. The boy no one noticed had walked into a glass tower with nothing but his honesty, and the truth had done the rest. If this story moved something in you, if Jericho's journey reminded you that integrity is never wasted, that God sees the honest choice even when no one else does, then do something with that feeling right now. Like this video. It tells us the story meant something to you. Share it with one person who needs to be reminded that doing the right thing still matters. Subscribe if you believe that the people the world overlooks are often the ones carrying exactly what the world needs. And drop a comment below. Tell me what part of this story stayed with you. Tell me if you would have returned the wallet. Tell me what your grandmother told you. Because stories like Jericho's do not end on a sidewalk. They continue in every person who hears them and chooses, just a little more firmly than before, to do the honest thing. See you in the next one.